3 black women have been unalived by their partners since April 1st. And men, I'm going to need y'all to call y'all to the front. Now, before we get into it, make sure you like, share, comment, subscribe, do all the things, because I talk my shit and we have a good time over here. But obviously, this is not a good time post. Men, I need to understand what is going on with y'all. Is it the fragile ass egos? Is it the fact that your mommies didn't teach you emotional regulation? Is it the fact that y'all are just so used to having control and having your way, you can't take it? But the fact that 3 black women have been unalived by their husbands since April 1st is a problem. We had the Coral Springs Vice Mayor, Nancy Metoyer Brown, unalived by her husband on April 1st. And this poor woman's family just lost their son in December because he was a victim of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school pew-pewing. And that young man had depression, had injuries. And so he unalived himself in December for their daughter 2-3 months later to be unalived by her husband. You had Ashley Janae just unalived this past weekend by her fiance partner. And now you've got this Lieutenant Governor Fairfax who unalived his wife and himself because he's a coward. So he didn't even try to get arrested for it. He just unalived himself with his children at home. And y'all men are in the comments getting mad when people are saying men are doing this, and it's not all men. It don't matter. If y'all are not checking the men in your lives, in your circles who are doing wrong, you're part of the problem. And I'm really irritated with the black men I'm seeing of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, that was this man's fraternity, posting memorials to him, and never mentioning this poor woman who was his victim. Because he was my brother and he was a great guy. He wasn't a great guy, because great guys don't unalive their wives. Great guys aren't accused of SA like he was. Great guys don't, because their wives want to divorce them, unalive her and don't move out the house and just say, okay, this chapter is over. Great guys don't do that. And the fact that y'all are on this app writing sad memorials to this man when he unalived his wife in front of his children, he did not care about her nor his children. He did not care that his children have to live their lives knowing they saw their mother's body and knowing that their father did it and then he did this to himself. He's a coward. And actually, Alpha Phi Alpha, you should be scratching him from the rolls, not uplifting him. Y'all need to get it together, and you men need to be checking other men. It is out of control. Women should not be getting unalived by their men because they don't want to be with you, or because you've done something wrong and they found out about it. It is time for y'all to get your freaking balls back, start acting like grown-ass adults, stop being these coward-ass men, and protecting women, which is what you're supposed to be doing, not unaliving them. It's disgusting, and you wonder why we choose the bear.
Hey, so let's not do tributes to the guy who killed his wife and traumatized his kids. But the former Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Justin Fairfax, actually can't be the black men's mental health mascot that you want him to be, and I will tell you why. His dying act was so dishonorable because it fit neatly within the textbook character arc of an abuser. It fits so neatly that he's actually the second man to carry out nearly identical high-profile spousal murders this month. My wife was a domestic abuse prosecutor for years. I've watched women and men run up to her in grocery stores to thank her for helping them get out of abusive relationships. And one of the things that she said time and time again that sticks with me in a moment like this, she said that hands down, the most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she is leaving. Because the abuser, whose MO is power and control, is losing that power and control. And you know who else typically has a thing for power and control? Rapists. The Venn diagram in the Justin Fairfax situation is starting to look like a circle, my friends. Men spend so much time saying not all men when women bring up their negative experiences with men. And the thing that's blowing my mind in this situation is that when a man does the unthinkable, we're trying to extrapolate that into a conversation about the mental health of all men. I'm trying to say we can't have it both ways, fellas. And rest in peace to Dr. Serena Fairfax.
Obviously, the internet has been ablaze over the last few weeks as we've seen countless stories of Black women being unalived by their intimate partner. You have the case of Justin Fairfax and his wife, Serena Fairfax. You have the tragic scenario of Vice Mayor Nancy Bowen, who was allegedly unalived by her husband. And then you have Shamar Elkins, who's being accused of unaliving 8 kids, 7 of them who were his biological children. And so It's been a very tense time, especially for Black women. There's been a lot of anger, frustration, disgust, disdain. And while I think the anger is warranted, I want to be very cautious in making sure that the anger is not misdirected. Because when we don't have the right information and we actually don't understand what's going on, especially as it pertains to DV and intimate partner violence, it's very easy to start to perpetuate narratives that are actually not true, that are stereotypes, and ultimately do nothing but create a further divide and wedge in the Black community that doesn't help anyone and certainly doesn't get to the root of what is actually going on. So I wanted to highlight this article that I saw from Madame Noir that is critiquing a panel that Roland Martin recently did regarding Justin Fairfax. And I think it's a great opportunity to start to examine a lot of the different popular narratives that are going around right now as it relates to IPV, intimate partner violence, Black love, Black men, and ultimately get down to the truth and hopefully the solution. So, so this article, it reads, Serena Fairfax was unalived, so why is Roland Martin centering Justin Fairfax's feelings? And it reads, Serena Fairfax should be the focus in all these discussions, not the mental health of the man who took her life while her children were home. So I think we're already seeing the framing. We don't need to really care about what was going on in the mind of a murderer, right? That's basically the framing. We need to be more concerned in the victim who was unalived. Now, here's where I think Black men and Black women can start missing each other. So many Black men might look at Justin Fairfax, and while they don't agree with what he did, there's automatically going to be more sympathy to his downfall because we have to remember the context of how this happened. It wasn't like Justin Fairfax had, a long-standing history of being a criminal. This was a very respectable man who had a great educational background, who had a really promising career. He was rising the ranks politically, and then essentially, just over a series of accusations that were never really fully confirmed, lost everything. He went from making, $400,000 a year to almost being the governor to pretty much overnight going to $11,000 a year. And the next year is zero, pretty much losing all of his political affiliations and his reputation. And there are many men who would actually look at his downfall and consider it a public lynching. Not that there is any justification for what he did, but I think there are many men who are willing to acknowledge the ways in which they believe he was victimized, perhaps not by a particular individual, but by an overall system that leveraged individuals and, leveraged different systems to ultimately undermine his entire life. And that, I think, is what they are also reacting to when they consider his overall downfall, not just his heinous crime. And so I think that is automatically the missing link in how the story is going to be told, because there's going to be Black men who want to remember his humanity because not only of the history and the ways in which Black men have been demonized historically, but the pain that is oftentimes that can resonate with when they feel like a Black man has been unjustly dealt and hasn't really had their just due. And so, of course, there's going to be many people who are going to judge him based upon the last heinous and tragic act that he committed. That was violent and grotesque and overall heartbreaking. Yet and still, you're likely to have men who can at least empathize and sympathize with his experience because they understand what it means to be unjustly treated and targeted. Not that they can necessarily justify the way in which he ultimately spiraled, but they can have sympathy and empathy for a Black man feeling like the whole world is against him. And in a very real sense, it actually was when you understand his political and his career downfall. So here it says, when news broke the former Virginia Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax shot and unalived his wife, Dr. Serena Fairfax, before unaliving himself, the facts were immediate and devastating. A woman was unalived in her home, and 2 children were left to live with the aftermath. But within hours, something else began to take shape. On social media, Black men, including Roland Martin, posted photos of Fairfax smiling and fraternity appear at events and rooms full of promise and prestige. They remembered him as a brother, a good man, and someone full of potential. The images were soft, nostalgic, and intimate. It's the kind of visual storytelling that gently pulls the viewer away from the violence back and toward the man. What's really interesting is, media does the exact same thing, particularly of its white criminals. Media loves to glamorize and valorize its white criminals. It loves to extend sympathy to white men and sometimes white women, who do heinous crimes because it still sees their humanity. And it sounds like, based upon the way that she's setting up this article, it sounds as if Roland Martin and maybe some of the men who were on her panel basically did the same thing. They were looking at Fairfax as a human in spite of his violent crime, which is something, again, like I said, we see white media do all the time for its criminals. But that is actually what made a lot of women, and particularly Black women, upset. Now let's continue. It says, on Roland Martin Unfiltered, what could have been a focused, unflinching conversation about domestic violence became a sprawling discussion centered on Black men's mental health, status loss, depression, and emotional burden of public failure. Now, here's where I think the conversation already starts to go left. I agree with her analysis that having an unflinching conversation about domestic violence and DV is very appropriate and needs to happen. The problem is a lot of women actually are not ready to have an unflinching conversation about DV because when they do, the data actually does not necessarily support the popular narrative. So the popular narrative is men bad, woman good. Men evil, right? Women angelic, right? Men villains, women victims. That's like the narrative. But the data is actually far from that. What we find when you actually look at interpersonal violence is that, first of all, in most cases, or in many cases, IPV is bidirectional, meaning men hitting women, women hitting men. So they are hitting each other. It is like a mutual thing. And actually, more often than not, women initiate violence towards men. That means women are oftentimes the first one to hit, to punch, to kick, to do whatever to start the fight physically. Women are the ones who are the most likely to actually do that. The findings published in the Journal of Family Violence showed that women reported higher rates of initiating violence, about 28.3% compared to 21.6% for men. And then in another study that was published in 2012 in Partner Abuse Volume 3, Issue 2, it showed in relationships, women reported hitting or hurting their male partners a little more than twice as often as men did to women. So for white couples, white women were 2.26 times more likely, right, to hit or harm their white male partner. And for Black couples, it was 2.27 times more likely. Black women specifically are 2.27 times more likely to, hit their male partner. And so what I'm trying to say is that when you actually start to peel the layers back even just a little bit when it comes to DV and domestic violence, you see that an honest, unflinching conversation about domestic violence shows that it's a lot more complex and actually a lot more mutual than what is oftentimes believed and shared. This in no way excuses the heinous crimes that took place over this last month, but it does put those crimes into context, and it does undermine a silent agenda to promote propaganda or a narrative. Because if someone is really serious about addressing trends in any particular community, then they're going to be willing to look at the systems and the different components that actually drive those conditions. However, someone who is actually serious about trying to address overall trends in marriages in the Black community or whatever are going to be willing to look at all of these different stories within context, not to undermine the severity of them, but to be able to frame them into the larger context of what actually creates or cultivates an environment where domestic violence and interpersonal violence can thrive. And what you'll often find is that more often than not, those things are driven by environmental and outside factors, not just Black men are bad because they're Black. And the heinous crime of one Black man is not an indication of the overall character and capacity of all Black men. And an honest conversation about interpersonal violence and DV is not going to simplify minimize the topic to something as simple as race. Here it says a tragic story about also mental health, depression, and the silent killer among especially Black men, Martin said as he introduced the segment. That, but also wasn't a transition. It was a pivot and a deflection. It took a moment that should have stayed centered on violence and accountability and rerouted it into a conversation about the killer's feelings, his struggles, and his humanity. That was the real conversation. The woman he shot multiple times was reduced to the setup. So again, this particular writer and many Black women felt like this segment became more about trying to sanitize the image of a Black man who ultimately unalived his wife, himself, and left his kids to experience the aftermath. And they're saying, why are you trying to sanitize and sympathize a man who did a crime that is heinous and that is not excusable? And then here it says, to build that conversation, Martin assembled a panel of Black male psychologists, along with commentary that worked, intentionally or not, to reframe the act of violence as the endpoint of a psychological unraveling rather than a deliberate exercise of power and control. This is how narrative machinery works. Feel like it's probably happening is if and when you have Black men who are saying, well, not all Black men are this, they might be reacting to the fact that there has been a decade, if not centuries long, smear campaign against the Black male image, where Black men have pretty much always been classified as these monstrous, violent, criminal creatures who, are just one look away, they're just one moment away from just crashing out and unaliving everybody. Like, that's the way in which they've been characterized. Black men are naturally going to be reacting to that and saying, hey, we're not all like this. And again, the context of that is a society that has consistently undermined and demeaned Black men just because they're Black. Now, was this the best way to do it? Was this the most effective way to do it? Was this the scenario to do it? I didn't see the panel, so I can't, it's hard for me to really know because I didn't actually see the panel. But as I'm reading this, like, it may have been more effective, to, who knows how, maybe it may have been the most effective to have an entire segment that was just focused on Serena Fairfax, Dr. Serena Fairfax, her life, what she did, her contributions, the legacy she left, and then maybe had another segment where you were talking about Justin Fairfax and dealing with his mental health and depression, because, the reality is these kind of conversations, they are necessary if the thought and the hope is to actually analyze the ways in which a man who was very successful, who went, who had the degree, who had the success, who had the access, who had the notoriety, who had the things that you would think a man would want, and devolved to a place of unaliving his wife, like, that would be something that is worth asking. That would be something that is worth critiquing. Would be something that is worth analyzing. And so I do think those conversations need to be had. They need to be had honestly and thoroughly, if nothing else, to try to prevent it from happening again, or at least be able to spot signs before it could potentially happen. So the conversation itself is warranted, but perhaps the way in which it was done and the timing and the setup was not the most effective. And again, I didn't see it, but these are just based upon, from what I've heard. Okay, here it says the Dr. Tart introduced what he called the fallen high-status Black man phenomenon, walking viewers to Fairfax resume. He graduated from Duke and Columbia Law School. He was a rising political star. And then the decline, rape allegations, career loss, divorce, a custody battle. He framed it as a narcissistic injury cascade, a neat clinical arc that turned a brutal act of violence into something that could be studied, mapped, and ultimately understood. What got lost in that framing was the simplest fact of all. A man made a decision to unalive his wife, because once you turn violence into a cascade, it starts to sound less like a choice and more like a process, less like accountability and more like inevitability. Dr. Washington took a step further by wrapping the conversation in the language of neuropsychology. We heard about limbic systems, emotional dysregulation, and internal collapse. He walks viewers through what happens when a man loses his buffers like status, identity, and control. His comments were clinical and powerful form of deflection. Because the more you locate the balance in the brain and chemical circuits and collapse, the less it reads as an act of power and as a deliberate choice. It becomes something that happened inside him instead of something he did to her. So here's the thing. These men, again, they are humanizing Justin Fairfax. Based upon what she's saying, they're humanizing him. They're saying, how did a man who had all of these amazing qualities devolve to the point of unaliving himself and his wife? So they're seeing him as a human. The writer here is seeing him as a murderer who doesn't deserve any of the sympathy and doesn't really deserve anything other than to be castigated and called a murder. And all the focus seems to be on Dr. Serena Fairfax. And again, that's where I feel like in these conversations, people miss each other. But what's interesting to me is the way in which the black men are willing to humanize another black man who committed a heinous crime, but still you remember his humanity, and the way in which this particular writer and other black women don't want to humanize him. They want to put him in the category of murderer, and not only him, but black men who actually sympathize with him. They want to put him. They want to put those men in that same category of, if you are willing to sympathize with that man, then who's to say that under the same conditions you wouldn't do the exact same thing? So that's what's really interesting about the ways that I see in which this conversation is being had. And that's what I think the problem is, because I think there is a mixture of misinformation, there's a mixture of a misandry, and let's also be clear here, there is a double standard. There's a double standard here. Another reason I believe men are taking the attempt to try to understand the humanity of this person is because these are things that actually happen when the gender or the race is reversed. As I mentioned before, white media, they sanitize and they love to sanitize their serial killers. And so if this is a white person doing this, they would sit down and do the same thing if it was a white man. If it was a woman, anytime a woman is engaged in a violent crime, first of all, those crimes just usually don't make headlines. It's very rare that you see a woman committing a violent crime makes headlines. It's not that they don't do them, because they do. And there are black women who have engaged in very violent, heinous crimes against their intimate partner, against even their kids. But those things don't make headlines. But if they do, oftentimes the first thing that's going to be asked is, okay, so what caused her to do it? What was going on with her mentally? Why would she devolve to this place? Because the assumption is that black women are starting from a moral, starting from a place of being the moral authority. They're starting from a place of assumed moral goodness. And so if a black woman who was assumed to be morally good as a baseline, if she devolves to a point of unaliving her kids or her spouse or herself or whatever, then there's usually a question of what happened to their mental health. But that's because the humanity is presumed. But when it comes to black men, not necessarily. Because humanity isn't always presumed, then I think there's more of a willingness and a quickness to be like, you're just a murderer. You're just a murderer, right? So I think there seems to be a reaction that's coming from a very different place. When you pair that kind of public mourning that Martin and others did on social media with a televised segment that centers on his depression, his fall, his internal struggle, you're not just covering a story, you're curating a memory. You're helping decide which version of this man gets to live on. The accomplished one, the promising one, the brother, not the murderer who destroys his family. Right. See, and again, this is where I'm saying we're already seeing that black men have a willingness to want to see his humanity. Black woman, or the black woman that she represents, don't. They don't want to see his humanity. That's really what it comes down to. And that begs the question, should you see the humanity of somebody who killed themselves and their wife and left their kids? Like, should you do that? And I think the answer goes down to, okay, well, what answer would you hold everybody accountable to? If you want to hold black men to that same accountability, totally, completely fine. Would you hold black women to that same level of accountability? Would you hold white men? Like, I think the bigger question here is not even necessarily whatever conclusion you have, but how willing would you be to keep that same energy for all other parties, for other people? And what we run into when it comes to these scenarios, and what oftentimes black men and black women, when they miss each other in these scenarios, is that there's an unwillingness to reckon with not only the misinformation around IPV and the way in which that misinformation has cultivated a lot of this misdirected disdain and anger and a lot of misinformation, but also where the double standards exist. But because there's misinformation, because there's this belief about black women always being victims and black men being villains, because of that can create room for the root cause and the root issue to actually not be addressed. Because the root issue isn't that black men are collectively ego-driven, insecure, violent children who, under the right circumstance or as soon as you bruise their ego, are just going to go and just unalive everybody. And black women are just these, docile victims that are just, one moment away from being unalived by the black man that they sacrificed for. Like, that's not the truth. The reality is that like we said, IPV violence is bidirectional. Women actually tend to initiate it more, and that's, another conversation for another day. But it's a lot more bidirectional, and it's oftentimes aggravated with the outside components that contribute to violence, such as obviously stress, economic stressors, relationship dynamics, economic stress, survival issues of feeling isolated, unsupported, lack of access. There are external factors that can dramatically impact IPV. And there is a reason that, generally speaking, the more someone has a stable income and education and healthcare and support systems, the more those things in mental health, the more those things are in place, the less likely you are to have acts of violence. So that's what I'm saying. These conversations are necessary, but if there is an unwillingness to at least understand where both sides are coming from, then that's where I feel like Black men and Black women miss each other. And I can understand why Black women would be like, why are you out here trying to valorize a killer, somebody who killed his wife and his kids? That doesn't make any sense. I can understand why somebody would say that. I could also understand why Black men might be quick to want to add humanity to another Black man simply because they've been existing in a history and a paradigm where their humanity is constantly being questioned. I'm thinking, maybe this just wasn't the best way to do it. Maybe it would have been better, again, like I said, for him to have a segment where he was just focusing on Dr. Serena Fairfax. And then if he wanted to have a segment that talked about Black men and mental health and how do you prevent this from happening? What are the signs? Maybe that would have been more effective if it was another segment versus it seeming like the entire segment was focusing on ultimately the perpetrator and not the victim, right? So here it says, because most people who experience oppression do not kill their spouses, most people who go through divorce, career loss, or public humiliation do not pick up a gun and end another person's life. So when a show builds an entire segment around mental health and the immediate aftermath of intimate partner homicide, it risks doing something dangerous. It begins to blur the line between explanation and excuse. The blurring is reinforced when Martin himself asserts that a person who commits domestic violence is, by definition, dealing with a mental health issue that has to be confronted. What he is doing is reframing. It carries consequences. So basically, again, she's saying, no, you're basically trying to get him away from facing the accountability of what he actually did. But you're saying, oh, it's mental health, mental health, mental health. No, he actively chose to do what he did. Don't blame that on him and his insanity. And to that, I would say, I agree. I agree with what she says. If she is willing and would be willing to hold that same energy for Black women when they commit violent crimes. As I said before, Black women's violent crimes they're oftentimes not promoted in the way Black men's violent crimes are. Nevertheless, if there's a willingness to hold that same energy across the board, then I'm like, okay, that's consistent. The problem is we don't always see that. We exist in a culture that pretends to be about equality and parity, but when it comes down to accountability being held, when it comes down to criminality being, but now when it comes down to crimes and just certain things in general, it seems as if we can kind of operate in a double standard. And this is also why sometimes men are pushing back. They're like, okay, well, if these people are able to do this thing right over here, I'm going to apply the same metric to myself. If we're able to ask women anytime she does something, what's her mental health, what's going on? If we're able to ascribe her a level of humanity, even if she ended up unaliving her kids, even if she ended up putting them in ovens and burying them in her backyard, and these are actually cases that have happened, like even if we're willing to look at those women and try to understand what happened to them mentally, then we should be able to do the same thing for men, right? And so you also have men who are looking at it from that paradigm of just like, in the spirit of all things equal, we should have the right to do exactly what she would do. You guys can go and read the rest of the article if you want. The crimes are horrible. I don't know how else to put it. They were horrible. And I do think that they bring up some healthy, warranted conversations. However, if the conversations are not based upon actually what's going on, it's not based upon actual data, and if there's not a willingness to try to even understand where both sides are coming from in any capacity, then it's very easy to miss each other, and then it's very easy for this to become another reason to just further drive a wedge or to perpetuate unnecessary gender war. But anyways, y'all, that's what I have. What do y'all think about this whole thing? Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section. Thank you so much for listening if you've gotten this far, and we'll talk later, okay? Bye.